Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Data Storytelling webinar. My name is Karina Radovanovich, and I'm joined here with Dallas Salazar and Greg Deckler to talk to you about telling a story in the oil and gas industry with Power BI. So let's switch over to the agenda slide. Here's a look at what you can expect from today's webinar. After I kick off with introductions, you'll hear from Dallas on why he uses interactive data visuals in journalism, and then a particular challenge that he has in the oil and gas industry. Greg Deckler will take over from there to do a Power BI deep dive on building the reports, and then Dallas will come back on to talk about using Power BI to tell the story that he has at hand today. Finally, we'll finish with a little bit of more information and tips for next steps for me. I also want to remind everyone that we've got a great Q&A going on live in the chat window that you can engage with at any time, and we'll also save time at the end to answer any questions that we didn't have a chance to cover. So please jump in there and let us know what's on your mind and what we can talk about today to better deliver on what you're expecting. Let's look at who we have on the call today. So my name's Karina Radovanovich, and I've been working at Microsoft for just about 7 years now in roles across the company and across the world, actually. There's always been a common thread with my roles, and that's that I love working with data. And so that's what you'll see no matter whether I was in marketing or today I'm in the commercial communications team. And I spend most of my time telling stories both with and about data. And that's why I had the pleasure of working with both Dallas and Greg, who are the stars of the show today. So Dallas is joining us from Austin, Texas, where he leads an enterprise consulting firm. He's also a huge fan of Power BI and a renowned data storyteller, mostly for the financial market site Seeking Alpha. So when Greg isn't taking companies public, he's discovering and visualizing stories hidden in the massive amounts of data that he works with. And that's why he met Greg. So Greg's a director at Fusion Alliance and the solution director of cloud services, as well as a Microsoft MVP for our data platform. Among Greg's many, many skills, he's also an excellent mentor and coach and is a total pro with Power BI and data storytelling. So the two teamed up to work on a particular project that they're going to share with you today. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Dallas to talk to us about why he uses interactive data visuals for his journalism efforts.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you guys for carving out the time today. Really appreciate it. So I have been writing in one form or another online, dating back to just about predating BI solutions. And what I had noticed was that as globalization of markets and some other capital market instances were taking shape, telling the stories was becoming more and more complicated. And so using data visuals in the stories was becoming something that was absolutely necessary to sort things out, to allow for greater clarity and to keep high engagement. And so after sorting through some of the different solutions out there, I came across Power BI and I started to just sort of become self-taught in how to use it. But I mostly came into interactive data visuals from a journalism standpoint because it was a necessity. The ability to tell the story, to tell it clearly, to keep engagement high, to potentially provide a convincing argument if it were something that was a value add. It just wasn't going to be possible, and I'll show you an example of that here shortly, without using data visuals and without having a platform that could do that for me quickly and in a way that was presentable. And I'm not somebody with a great amount of technical skill or design skill, so Power BI was a solution that kind of was tailor-made. It was perfect for me, and it's only gotten better since the first iteration. So. But that's how I sort of came into being a so-called data journalist or a visual journalist, and you'll find that my writing has almost become more heavily comprised of data visuals than text, because it's just so much easier to show than to tell. especially when you're getting into some of the complicated intricacies of capital markets. So that's, I guess, an introduction as to how Power BI helped me tell a story and to be a better journalist for that part of my professional career. Regarding the challenge in the oil and gas industry, pre-Power BI, it was just pretty much impossible to tell the story. Breaking out dense data sets and complex things such as credit ratios or leverage ratios, things that are just simply easier to show than to tell. Getting into some of the mathematical calculations involved. I mean, it was a very quick and easy way to get rid of readers, right? To make them sort of fall off, and you were just looking at sort of how, even with Power BI in the early days of Power BI, before I was a part of this MVP program, how the data set was kind of aggregated and architected. It was very complex. It took a lot of time, and it allowed a lot of error to take place. So there sometimes that could exacerbate the problem. But and this is a video that's actually playing, and I'm talking in it. But you should start to see some things moving around. But this is how I used to have to tell the stories. I used to have to do written text. I used to have to film short screencasts where I could explain to people in spoken word kind of what exactly I was writing, just so that they wouldn't fall asleep or get up and leave their terminal in general. And they weren't able to interact with the data. They either had to write down the timestamp of the place in the video that they wanted to go to hear a reiteration of the point I was trying to make, or they had to screenshot it for review later. I mean, these are just things that people aren't going to do when trying to understand the point that you're trying to make. And so, basically, prior to getting hooked up with the MVP program and meeting Greg, this was the best method that I had found for engaging with readers, again, making a compelling case and just doing a good job from a journalism standpoint. I mean, literally speaking through a screencast what I was trying to write, because I knew the writing was so dry and didn't do the best job of helping visualize the scenario. But still, you can see, even with the older iteration of Power BI, it was possible. And this will give us an example here in just a few clicks when I removed these variables, how the data was moving around, et cetera. I was showing these sort of interdependence of the data points to each other. So, and that was fine. It was executing the point. It was getting us from point A to point B, but it wasn't doing it in style, and it wasn't the highest efficacy that it could have been. And it certainly wasn't fun for the reader or for the viewer. At least I wouldn't think so, unless data is what you do, right? But this is a good example of sort of the problems and the challenges in using data that I'm sure we all face. It's not, I'm sure, unique to oil and gas. If you're covering politics, or if you're covering sports or healthcare, you're using dense data sets, and telling the story is difficult. So yeah, that's just an example up there. It's a short video. And as Greg scrolls a little bit further down this Medium post here, not only was I using the screencast, but I would have to screenshot and use still frames of the screencast, and then get into kind of extensive long form writing on, hey, when I removed this data outlier, this is what it looked like. When I removed this, and it became almost a dry course on what I was trying to help you visualize. So effectively, the density of the data, the aggregate size of the data, the interdependence of the data points, so seeing them move in relation to each other, was A, limiting, B, difficult in expression, C, not that entertaining to the reader, and D, obviously, probably extremely difficult to read to completion. And I started to see that in the metrics, and that was why I was interested in participating in this MVP program, because I noticed that my impressions were falling, my read to completions were falling, the engagement, things like comments were falling. referral points were falling, whether that was a like or a share or a heart, as they do on Medium. All of those metrics regarding viability and the health of my note or article were deteriorating. So I knew that I needed another solution, and that took us to the point of a well-timed introduction to Greg Deckler, who was able to help me develop a model that does a much better job. It's a single facing model that does a much better job of allowing the user to interact with the data on their own time, using their own variable inputs. And we'll show you this. This will make a lot more sense when you see it than what I was doing prior. And since I've been deploying this model, which was something that I had actually been working on for a while, but was unable to complete because I lacked the technical prowess of somebody like Greg. Once I was able to complete this, it really changed the way that I'm able to communicate with my reader base. And again, maybe, if you're viewing this or you're interested in Power BI, maybe your audience is a little less dry and your subject matter is a little bit more parties and dancing. But for me, I think that I'm a good example of somebody who you took sort of a worst case scenario, kind of some of the less interesting conversation that you could have, capital markets, specifically, oil at stressed entities. And Greg found a way to make this easily able to engage with, and at the same time, expressive, infinitely expressive and educational. So that's sort of just in a nutshell how I came into data journalism, how I became such a Power BI fanboy, and the challenges that I was facing, even using a platform as competent and as extensive as Power BI. So I'll turn it over to Greg on that note, but I do want to say that it's important to remember this screen here, because this is a good sort of before picture of, and you guys will have access to this link to go through, and we'll see if you can make it 30% of the way through the note without saying, yeah, I see what he was saying. This is terribly hard to, it's terribly hard to read. It's very dry, it's not interactive, and it's almost instructional, whereas Greg's solution is none of those things. So I'm interested to hear some feedback from you guys, but I will turn it over to Greg, and thank you for allowing me to introduce myself.
Hey, thanks, Dallas. So this is Greg Deckler, and I am going to show you kind of behind the scenes of the data model, and then we'll kind of go into the big reveal, I guess, of what we ended up with. So if we're take a look at this from the queries perspective, which is what I have on the screen here. So what Dallas gave me was a bunch of Excel spreadsheets, in essence, that covered such things as stock prices, debt ratios, commodity prices, those kinds of things. And I can jump to the data model that we built. And it looks simple enough, definitely less complex, I guess you could say, than I think if you notice the data model that Dallas had built earlier. There were a lot more tables and that sort of thing. This is, what the data model that we ended up with, and it looks simple, but it's actually fairly complicated. It actually has 3 fact tables: stock prices, commodity prices, debt ratios, and they're connected by common dimensions of things like companies and date. And we even have a many-to-many relationship that exists here. That we have this bridge table, quarter years, bridging debt ratios to date table in a many-to-many relationship. And one thing that I've noticed, and I want to point out, especially when dealing with multiple fact tables, is that you have to pay attention to how your relationships, the direction of your relationships. This is something that Power BI does really well, in that you can create these fairly complicated data models where you have relationship flows and constraints flowing in only one direction. And that's something particularly important within when you have many fact tables involved. Let me jump over to the queries, and I'll show you how these tables were built from their source data. And some of these are pretty simple, right? Things like companies, these are just enter data queries. And I tried to design these in such a way that Dallas could easily maintain and extend this over time. So if he ever wants to add another company in here, you can just come in here and add another company in the query itself. And the same thing for quarter years. That's just another enter data query. But now some of these, there's a couple of neat things I want to point out here. So I had, Dallas gave me oil prices with these Cushing OK WTI spot price FOB dollars per barrel. It's the first time I ever heard of that term. But this is just an Excel spreadsheet with 2 columns essentially. And then I also had gas prices, and it's again a spreadsheet with 2 columns, and they both have a day column in them. So the logical thing to do might be that you might think, well, I want to have a single table of commodity prices. I can merge these tables together such that I'd have day and then this column and then another column. But what I did instead, because I was thinking ahead in terms of how we wanted to use this data within the visualization process, I instead came up with and used something a little different for the commodity prices. And instead of a merge query, I actually used an append query. So if you can see here, what I'm doing is I have, oil prices and gas prices are coming from these 2 Excel spreadsheets that Dallas gave me, and I'm just appending them together. Now, when I do that, essentially what I get is I get duplicate dates and either get a column filled in for this Cushing oil price per barrel, and another column over here for the natural gas price per barrel. So when Power BI does this, it says, okay, both of these files have a day column. I'm going to append that together in a single column, but then they have different columns here, so I'm just going to put those in there as well. But I'm going to basically have duplicate dates for all those dates, and this column's going to be null for all of those rows until I get down to where I actually have my gas prices in that. So what I did with this then is I added a conditional column in here, which essentially is this commodity price. And essentially what this conditional column does is that if the oil price per barrel is null, then it uses the gas price. Otherwise, it uses the oil price. And then I have a similar conditional column that gives me the commodity that the commodity price is for. So again, if the oil price per barrel is null, then it's going to say gas. Otherwise, it's going to say oil. And the reason I did it this way is that I can end up with then this column where I have the day, commodity price, and commodity. And this commodity is tailor-made for a slicer in Power BI, which is the reason why I did it this way. So then essentially I have a many-to-one relationship between commodity prices, and these are joined on day. And so now what I have here is a way that I have an easy way to slice which commodity price we're interested in, but also slice it by a day because I have this many-to-one relationship here. So that was a little bit different and a little bit of a different way of attacking the problem than one might go at it if they were coming at it from somebody that wasn't thinking ahead in terms of how we wanted to actually use that within a visualization. And that's the whole purpose of this. You want to think ahead in terms of how you're going to use the data visually, and that is a lot of times going to affect how you want to import that data and model that data. So then I had stock prices, and stock prices was actually sitting out here. Essentially, it was a series of Excel spreadsheets, and so they were all dumped into one folder. So the nice way of doing this was I could just point this actually to a folder, point it to a folder, and it brings in Power BI actually, when you do a folder-based query, it actually brings in and creates these first few steps right here, all the way down to expand the table. What's going on here is that it creates this Power BI M query, if you will, and it invokes that. And what that does is that reads the binary information in form and creates a table column, which is right here. It then goes through and renames it, removes the other columns, so you're left with just the table column, and then it expands that table column. And so now you have all the information from all of the spreadsheets in that folder. This is an incredibly common paradigm for importing source data. So now we have this source name of where it came from, and then the columns within those Excel spreadsheets. And you can even go into and you can mess around with how that source data in this function, how it's transformed. I didn't really have to do that in this case. It was fairly simple. But then I added a few more steps. So I went out and filtered rows so that I got rid of any null dates. I always like to put in those kinds of steps into my queries just to account for outliers so that when you refresh the data, you don't get problems. And then I wanted to get rid of this XLSX because I really wanted the symbol names so I could match those up with my company's table. So I basically just split that source name based upon the period and then removed the XLSX column and then renamed the column to symbol. And now that matched up really nicely, and I could build a relationship based upon the symbol column table. I had another series of Excel spreadsheets that Dallas gave me on debt ratios. And so these were also all in one big folder. Now, the problem with this one is I tried to use a folder query and it didn't work out so well. But there's an alternative, a fallback, in terms of getting this all into one table, which is the debt ratios table, which contains information from all of those. What I had to do in this case, because of some of the manipulations like unpivoting columns and things like that, what I did was I created I essentially took one of the spreadsheets and used it as a template. So I pointed to my source, navigated to the right sheet. And as you can see here, this data is kind of a train wreck in terms of how it's laid out. It's not very nice in terms of how you want it to actually be modeled in Power BI at all. I have all these metrics over here, and then each of these columns actually represents a different quarter, and then you have a number for that metric for that quarter for all of these different metrics that you have here. And it goes on and on and on. This isn't the greatest data format. It's not very useful in terms of data modeling and that. So we have to transform it. And again, this is one of the strengths of Power BI. So what I did was I went ahead and promoted the rows. I then filtered the rows and filtered it down to just the two that we were interested in. We were interested in the net debt EBITDA and the total debt EBITDA. But I still have these big columns of data. So what I did was I took and selected column 1 and said unpivot all the other columns. And what that gave me is, it gives me my attribute essentially, what quarter it's in, and then what value it is for that particular point in time. And this is a much nicer format in terms of data modeling and what we're going to do with it in the visualizations. So then, of course, I can rename some of the columns. I can add a custom column. So in this case, I added just a column and I just hard-coded the value because I knew this was coming from the CHK. Again, I want to match this up with my company. So I just added that in there. And then I had to get rid of, we had an odd situation where there were some Q5s, as you can see right here, and we didn't want those. This is something, direction I took from Dallas. So what I did was I said, okay, give me the first 2 letters of this, and then filter the rows so I get rid of all the Q5s. And so that was easy enough. And then I could actually get rid of that column because I didn't need it anymore. I just needed it for the filtering aspects. So once I did this, then I could actually sit here and say, okay, I'm going to copy. I just right-click this query and say copy and paste. And I can paste it as this next one, CVX debt ratios. I can then change my source to the CVX ratios XLSX file and change my one custom column that I added to be CVX instead of CHK. And then basically rinse and repeat that for the other files that are in that folder. So not as automatic as just pointing to a folder and sucking in all the data. But then at the end of the day, I can create this very simple append query. So this is a query with one step, and all it's doing is saying append all of these different queries together. So that was another way, and because what we wanted to end up with is a single table of debt ratios for everything. So at the end of the day, that is what we ended up with, is this right here. So there's my debt ratios table. There's my companies table, stock prices, commodity prices, my date table, and my quarter years. And then actually over here are all my kind of intermediary tables as you were. And if you notice, they're grayed out, so I hide them from the overall model itself, along with my bridge table, this quarter years. So I'm going to hand this back over to Dallas as I switch to the report tab to show you the visualization in which we ended up with that we used this model in. Dallas?
Yeah, great. Thank you. And again, I think it's just incredible how he basically took 50 tables and turned them into 6, which, through his processes eliminated a lot of possibility for error, duplicative infrastructure, if you will, and just work in general. So that is amazing. And it created this model which became tab-based. This used to be page-based, and it was extremely slow. And if you weren't on a powerful enough device, it would actually cause issues with the device. So this had structural constraints in place as a data visual that limited the audience and the audience enjoyment in its original iteration. But again, this is just a great example of some of the operating and technical prowess of some of the folks in the MVP program. So, I can't really take any credit for that, but I just want to circle the wagons on exactly how evolved this final model is. So just to give you guys a quick, we basically took all the text in that medium note, which is hard to read, again, hard to process, it's dry, and we put it into this data visual. So what we were telling people was, and you can actually leave that right there, and maybe Greg can just take the x-axis here and type in like 22 or 25 or just, a few pluses. You'll see the data move on the screen. Well, you should. Yeah, I don't know if you guys can see that. Hopefully you can. I can. And what you'll see is a big hole begins to create itself in the middle of this graphic. And you can see the columns start to change just based on the variables that we're inputting here. And we're changing the variables. And you can just stop right there, Greg. But just to show you guys, you don't really need to know what the variable inputs are, how they affect the data visual. But one thing that you should know is that you can change them to fit your own expectations. So for instance, if you're analyzing a company's ability to make money at a certain price of oil, right, which might be important to your investments. I mean, if you're invested in ExxonMobil or Chevron or Shell, right, a lot of folks are. So this could say, look, while this guy might believe that the price of oil will be this high, I believe it's going to be a little bit lower. Let's see how profitable this company really is. Not what their presentations say or not what their marketing materials say, but let's see what the data shows how profitable they really are. Well, what this particular data visual does is it allows you to put in your own inputs and then to see how the variable inputs change or expose holes in the data. And there's a big white hole in the center of this data visual here, which I'll spend 10 seconds explaining this. This data visual is actually on an X, a Y, and a Z axis. So it appears to be tilted forward, but that big hole in there shows a weighting distribution shift from negative, or being more data points at the bottom, to positive, or being more data points at the top of the columns if you were to just split the columns horizontally sort of in half. And what that gap shows is where the company really starts to make a lot of money. And then that's simple. And in that 15-second explanation, using this data visual, I can tell a better story that's easy to understand, and that folks can have open architecture for shifting the variables and sort of doing their own analysis on their own time. They don't have to watch a video. They don't have to screenshot anything. They can just load this model, through a web browser and go about it on their own. And while they're doing it, they can select any individual data point within those pillars. Each square is its own day of trading, actually. And there's a bar across the top where the information will change. So you can be as granular as you'd like, or you can be as broadly stroked as you like. But so this is the final result of our work together. It's a model that we decided to call the double helix because it effectively is the DNA of any particular oil and gas company, at least their DNA, which we can assess their health based on inputs of commodity prices. And not to get too far into that, but this is, this is just an example of how storytelling can become powerful if you have the right data visual and if you can connect with the right people. And I do have a feeling that I would have ultimately ran into Greg through the forums, the Power BI forums, because that forum is incredible about getting quick and very, very detailed answers to questions. I use it often, actually, but I think that this is something that I'm almost certain you guys will have access to a page that has this model, and you can sort of flip tabs back and forth on your own time and see what became of, well, here it is. Well, what became of the initial note. I actually think it's in the other tab up top there, Greg. But in any case, this is the final result, and it's an incredible evolution of roughly 3 years of my work in developing it. And Greg actually took 2 days and found a way to just paint his masterpiece. So I think if you take anything away from this webinar, from me at least, who's been in the trenches, who's dealt with all the problems of telling a big data story, of telling a dense data set story, it's this: data visuals really help. Power BI as a platform is extremely helpful. Some of the advanced data visuals, like Sandance, which is the data visual we use to create the double helix model, some of the advanced data visuals can take you to a level of evolution that maybe you couldn't have reached without them. So they are worth experimenting with. And I think that we're now into a new area of data journalism where the journalist becomes the reader. The reader becomes the journalist. So because folks can now determine on their own which input I want to use to test this data, to make sure that this model has integrity, to make sure that the story I'm being told is not biased or manipulative of the data itself, right? So I think that's incredibly powerful in this day and age, and it allows the storyteller to tell a transparent story and a story that's compelling and that will resonate long after the reader has read to completion. So very, very thankful to have been a part of this program. I learned so much that I've taken away, and I have a model now that I can take to scale since I invested the time, and Greg was so nice to complete it for me. So a lot of takeaways from the program. Happy I participated. And with that, I will turn it over to Karina, I believe, unless I'm forgetting anything. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dallas and Greg. This is really one of my favorite success stories of how Power BI has become a critically important tool for telling stories with data, and how you guys work together. I think it's a great example of the community, kind of two different folks from within the same community joining forces in order to kind of both learn new ways of working with Power BI. I want to call out that a pretty important piece of the kind of data journalism efforts that Microsoft is leading is the publish to web capability in Power BI. I love, Dallas, when you talked about the reader becoming the journalist, because publish to web does really open up that possibility for someone that's talking about the news or telling a story with data to open it up to interpretation for the folks that might want to discover a different angle of the story, to make it really highly local and highly personal. If you are reading about your oil and gas industry, but you're only interested in a certain day or a certain aspect of that news, your data has the ability for someone to fill in and find the story that really matters to them without the burden on you as the storyteller to try to meet the needs of every person that may come into contact with that story. Publish to web lets the Power BI user, share their report embedded right in the online content. And then, as I said, folks can engage with it through that way. So it's still interactive, has all the great capabilities that we're used to with Power BI. So just want to make sure everyone knows that and is aware of it, and gives it a shot if it's kind of the area that you're working with as a Power BI fan. We talked about a couple of these resources already, but I just wanted to call them out as well. If you haven't already discovered the Microsoft Data Journalism page on the Power BI website, I really encourage you to check it out. It's got some amazing courses delivered by Alberto Cairo, who's a data visualization expert. He's an author, a professor, really a leader in the field. And we paired him with a couple of our Power BI engineers so that we could really get a blend of talking about the principles of data visualization and how to think about using that discipline, and then how Power BI becomes a part of that. So definitely a neat thing to check out when you've got some time on your hands to watch those. The Data Storytelling Forum is a particular area within the Power BI community. And Dallas, I love that you mentioned what a great resource that is. Super quick service. But also, we've started up this particular area so that folks can jump in and talk about the successes or the challenges that you're having for using Power BI to tell data stories. So if it doesn't fit in with the other topics in the community, encourage you to go there. We've also got some content pinned there that gives you some tips for getting started as a data storyteller, if that's something you haven't really dove into very deeply yet. And then the rest of the resources are particular to this specific project. You can find out all the information and explore it yourself with these links here. We still got a little bit of time for questions if anyone wants to type in. Just reading, catching up what's here. We'll hang around, but I'll go ahead and wrap up the formal broadcast of this webinar. So thanks so much for everyone that joined us live and for everyone that's joining us on demand. If you are on demand and you've got more questions, you know where to find us in that data storytelling forum in the Power BI community. And I hope you enjoy finding out more about data storytelling and what Power BI can do to support you in those efforts, and have as much fun as Dallas and Greg did working on the Double Helix project. Thanks, everyone.